Mark chapter 7, starting reading in verse number 31. Mark 7, verse 31, it says, "And again, departing from the coasts of Tyre and Sidon, he came into the sea of Galilee through the midst of the coast of Decapolis. And they bring unto him one that was deaf and had an impediment in his speech, and they beseech him to put his hand upon him. And he took him aside from the multitude, and put his fingers into his ears, and he spit and touched his tongue. And looking up to heaven, he sighed, and he saith unto him, Ephphatha, that is, be opened. And straightway his ears were opened, and the string of his tongue was loosed, and he spake plain. And he charged them that they should tell no man, but the more he charged them, so much the more a great deal they published it, and were beyond measure astonished, saying, He hath done all things well. He maketh both the deaf to hear and the dumb to speak." Now, as we've been talking about, Jesus has been making a trip through the northern Gentile area, north of the Galilee region of Israel. And so last time we saw him, he had gone up north to the area of Tyre and Sidon. By this point, he has made his way down the southwestern side onto the southeastern side to the east side of the Sea of Galilee into the Decapolis area, which is, if you remember back, the Decapolis area is where he healed or cast out the demons out of the demoniac, and he began to spread around that region what Jesus had done. And this is where Jesus had gone back. Again, it's a Gentile area. This is not a Jewish area. Now, this particular story here at the end of chapter 7 is one of only a few. There's only about 3 stories in the book of Mark that are not included in the other Gospels, particularly Matthew and Luke. So this is one of those 3. Now this is likely to show the love of Christ towards the Gentile people. Now we talked about last week how Jesus came to give the gospel to the Jews first, right? He came to the lost sheep of Israel. But that did not mean that he did not have a genuine love and compassion for the Gentile people, which we'll see in this story. And this was of particular interest to Mark, as Mark is writing to a mostly Gentile audience. And so it would make sense that Mark would include a story like this, whereas the others wouldn't. And so this is I think, to genuinely show the love, care, and compassion that didn't really change. You'll see the way he interacted with this man would be no different than the way that Jesus would have interacted with any of the, as we said, lost sheep, as it were, of Israel. However, interestingly enough, I do believe that this was also a way to show Jesus as the fulfillment of a particular prophecy found in the book of Isaiah. In Isaiah chapter 35, we read this. It says, "Say to them that are of a fearful heart, Be strong, and fear not. Behold, your God will come with vengeance, even God with the recompense. He will come and save you." And then it says this, "Then the eyes of the blind shall be opened, and the ears of the deaf shall be unstopped. And then shall the lame man leap as an hart, and the tongue of the dumb sing. For in the wilderness shall waters break out and streams in the desert." Now, I need to explain this just a little bit. This particular prophecy is specifically in regards to the millennial kingdom. However, I do think that this was a way for Mark to show that Jesus is going to be the fulfillment of that prophecy. Now, the Septuagint, if you've never heard of that word, the Septuagint was a Greek translation of the Old Testament that was in use in the time of Jesus. Now, the Septuagint, obviously writing at this particular point in the book of Isaiah, it uses, and I'm going to try to pronounce this word. It uses the Greek word mogalalos. Mogalalos. That's probably not how you pronounce that, but that's not the point. Mark uses this same word, this same Greek word, in verse 32 for the phrase impediment in his speech. This is the only time in the New Testament that particular word is used. Now, I think that Mark was using this in reference to this prophecy by Isaiah to show us that, again, Jesus is going to be the one to fulfill this prophecy. I don't think it's a coincidence that he happened to use the same word to talk about this particular dumb man who had, and when I say dumb, I'm talking about unable to speak, this particular man who had his tongue loosed and was now able to speak, and the same word being used by Isaiah in his prophecy. Now, nevertheless, in this story, like all of the healings of Jesus that we have seen, that we have talked about, we see a response to faith we see the great power and the great compassion of Christ. All of these things, we see it in this particular story. So let's just jump right back into it. Verse 31, and again, departing from the coast of Tyre and Sidon, he came unto the Sea of Galilee. This is on the Gentile area of Galilee, not the Jewish area, through the midst of the coast of Decapolis. Now, as I said, this is the same area where he freed the demoniac, and that is important because after sending the demons out of this man, if you remember back to the story, he wanted to come with Jesus. In fact, he tried to get on the boat with them, and he wanted to go with them and probably be one of his disciples and to go and just be around this man who had freed him from this absolute nightmare that he had been living in. But Jesus doesn't allow it. And Jesus tells him, he says, go home to thy friends and tell them how great things the Lord hath done for thee and hath had compassion on thee. And then it tells us, and he departed and began to publish in Decapolis how great things Jesus had done for him, and all men did marvel. And so this area of the Decapolis was a place where they have at least heard of some of the great things that Jesus was able to do. He was not the name Jesus would have been familiar to them at least. They would know that at the very least he has power over demons, and so he has some kind of power. And so he's not a stranger. Now, we don't see it in our text, but Matthew tells us that there was at this time, a very large crowd of people there that day, with actually many people being healed. You can turn back if you want to, but we read this in Matthew chapter 15, starting in verse number 29. It says, and Jesus departed from thence, and came nigh unto the Sea of Galilee, and went up into a mountain, and he sat down there. And it says in verse 30, and great multitudes came unto him, having with them those that were lame, blind, dumb, maimed, and many others, and cast them down at Jesus' feet, and he healed them, insomuch that the multitude wondered when they saw the dumb to speak, the maimed to be whole, the lame to walk, and the blind to see, and they glorified the God of Israel. And so it was not just this one man, it was not just this one group of people. There was a large crowd there that day whom Jesus was healing probably every person that came to him, because that's what Jesus did everywhere he went. Now, in our text, we see that there was a group of people. We don't know how many, but we see the plural pronouns here, so we know it was more than one. We see a group of people, we don't even know who they are. They bring this man to Jesus, and it simply says that they beseech Jesus to put his hands upon him. Well, they said that because this is what has been happening. There's been an entire group of people, a large gathering of people, bringing people to Jesus. And what is Jesus doing? He's putting his hands on them, and they're being healed. The maimed are made whole again. The blind are seeing. The lame are walking. The dumb are speaking. All of these miraculous things are taking place. And so they bring him to Jesus. They set him down, and they beseech him to put his hands upon him. Now, this unnamed group were acting in an act of intercession for this man. We'll see in a minute. This man was really unable to do these kinds of things. He was deaf. And as a result, he had some sort of speech impediment. That's all the information we get, but that is very common. If you know somebody today who is deaf and has been either since birth or from a very young age, it is incredibly common that they are going to have some sort of a speech impediment, because we learn to speak by hearing and mimicking. They haven't been able to do that. And so they don't know how to speak properly. It's not that they don't have the ability, they don't have the knowledge. And so this man, he really didn't know or had the ability to come to Jesus that day. And so they bring him. And we got to think about this particular man living in this particular time. They didn't have the things set up for people who are disabled like we have today. They didn't have the programs. They didn't have the protections. In fact, if you study this, the ancient Greeks, which the Greek society heavily influenced the Roman society under which they were living at this time, the ancient Greeks thought that the ability to reason was linked with the ability to speak. And so therefore, the deaf, who often have issues with speech, were seen as unintelligent or really unable to learn. And so they were very highly looked down upon. And so this man was unable to hear, unable to speak. He had to rely on the benevolence of others in order to just survive. And so that is what's happening here. Again, we don't know how many, we don't know their names, but they're acting in an act of intercession for this man. They bring him to Jesus. We don't know if they were family members. We don't know if they were friends. But either way, they interceded on his behalf based on their faith that Jesus would be able to heal. They've heard the stories. Now they've seen him do it. They have an absolute faith that Jesus is going to be able to do it. That's why they beseech him. They don't just throw him down and say, I don't know, just, try to do something. No, please put your hands upon this man because we've seen what you're able to do. We've heard what you did with the demoniac and Gadara. We've heard these things. We've now seen these. We have total and complete faith that you can fix and that you can heal this particular man. And so they did exactly what they should have done. And the command, that same command for intercession remains today. Now today, we do it a little bit differently. Today we intercede for others based on we still do it based on our faith in Christ, because we understand that Christ is able to do exceeding abundantly above all that we ask or think. That's what it tells in Ephesians chapter 3. Now the only difference today, the way that we do this a little bit differently, is we intercede through prayer. We're not physically bringing somebody and taking them somewhere. Today we intercede through prayer. We read in 2 Timothy 2, I exhort therefore that first of all, supplications, prayers, intercessions, and giving of thanks be made for all men. When we pray for other people, we do it for a reason. It's not something we do just to, waste the time. When we lift up others in prayer, we are bringing them before God in heaven, with the faith that if it is God's will, he can change the situation. He can heal. He can do whatever it is he needs to do. And so therefore we lift them up in prayer, and we're doing the same thing that these people did with this man today. We're bringing them before Christ in the faith that, again, if it is his will, he can change the situation. He can do what needs to be done. Now, we don't know, there would be really no way to know, we don't know if that man actually believed in Jesus' ability to heal him or not. But those that brought him most certainly did, and Jesus responded to their faith. It was not unlike the story we read in Mark earlier where the men dropped the lame man down through the ceiling. In fact, it specifically tells us in that story that Jesus healed in a response to their faith. That's the same thing that's happening here. Again, perhaps this man did believe. We just don't know. The text doesn't tell us. But they did. And Jesus is responding to faith as he has done throughout the book of Mark. And then we see him do something here that's a little interesting. So at the end of verse 32, they beseech him, put his hands on him. Verse 33 says, and he took him aside from the multitude. Now that is interesting. Now we read over in Matthew that all kinds of people are being dropped at his feet and he's healing them. Nowhere did we read over there that Jesus would take them aside and heal them. We would infer that he is simply placing his hands upon them and healing them where they were. But for some reason, he did it differently with this man. He comes and he takes him aside. So perhaps, and this is just me thinking this through, perhaps the others that were healed did not face the stigma of this man's particular malady. Warren Wiersbe, he said, Jesus took the man away from the crowd so that the healing would be private and the man would not have become a public attraction. Again, we've already talked about how the deaf were looked down upon by the Greeks, and if the Greeks did it, we can only assume the Romans did it. Again, they're very heavily influenced by their society. However, I think it went deeper than that. Perhaps this was Jesus giving a man who had likely been looked down upon and utterly ignored his whole life his full attention. You can only imagine the number of people who have simply walked by this man. I mean, he can see. He knows what's happening around him. And you can imagine how ignored he has been his whole life. Again, probably thought ill of, looked down upon, ignored. It's probably unlikely that outside of this group who brought him, that anybody has ever given him the time of day. And so here is Jesus taking this man, this Gentile, aside and giving him his full attention. Not only am I going to heal you, but I'm going to care for you emotionally. I'm going to show you that I love you. And so I think this was a way for Jesus to communicate to a man who could not hear that he meant something to him, that he loved him, that he was not just an outcast, but that he mattered to Christ. Again, I think it is unlikely that this man ever had the attention of somebody like this, especially somebody who he had never met before, somebody he did not know. And here is Christ showing him, not telling him because he can't, showing him, I care, and I'm going to help. And I think that's what's happening. And Jesus then does something that really, on the outset, I think seems very odd. So verse 33, he takes the man aside, and I think we can grasp why. But then we read, and he put his fingers into his ears, and he spit and he touched his tongue. And then looking up to heaven, he sighed, and he healed him at that point. And so we have seen Jesus heal in a few different ways, and we're not told in the text why he does it in this manner. But just in the book of Mark, not including the other Gospels, but just in the book of Mark, we've seen Jesus heal by touching. We've seen him heal just by speaking. We've seen him heal just by somebody coming and touching the hem of his garment. We've seen him heal from a distance, not even being in the same area. In other words, Jesus didn't have to do it this way. And so there's a reason why Jesus does it this way. He doesn't have to put his fingers in his ears. He doesn't have to do this. And so if Jesus is doing it this way, you understand and we can know that it is intentional. Jesus could have just simply sat back and said, yeah, you're healed, go. I mean, he could have done that way and it would have worked the same. But the question is why? Why this way? Now again, we got to understand, this man can't hear Jesus. He can't hear. He's deaf. He can't understand the things that are coming in from an auditory perspective. And so Jesus communicates with him in a manner that he could understand. So a lot of people think, and I agree, that this is a kind of a crude form of signing, of a sign language. Jesus puts his fingers in his ears, and this man knows that Jesus understands, you can't hear, and I'm going to fix this. He touches his tongue, and he knows that Jesus knows, I know that you can't speak well. I'm going to fix this. And so I think that this is a way in which Jesus is communicating to this man, again, by a crude form of sign language. Again, this is a tremendous compassion. This is tremendous love for a man who had probably never received it from anybody outside of his direct family. Now, before he actually heals this man, the text says that he looks to heaven and he sighs. This was a sigh of compassion. This was a sigh, I believe, of pain. I think this was a sign of sorrow because of this man's condition, because of the reality of sin. We know that this is kind of something that defined Jesus. It tells us in Isaiah 53, he is despised and rejected of men, a man of sorrows and acquainted with grief. Listen, Jesus would have been acquainted with grief because every time he healed somebody, every time he cast out a demon, every time he saw something that was not perfect in an individual, in the world, Jesus knows better than anybody that it is that way because of sin. Because sin entered into the world, and the world that he created perfectly is no longer that way because sin. And so Jesus looks at this man who is broken, who has been dejected, who has been looked down upon, and he sighs with sorrow because he knows sin has made it thus, and that is why am I in the world. Jesus knows better than anybody the effects of sin. He knows better than anyone the ultimate reason that this man had faced this hardship because sin destroys everything. The same word is used in Romans 8 where it says, for we know that the whole creation groaneth and travaileth in pain together until now. And not only they, but ourselves also, which have the first fruits of the Spirit, even we ourselves groan within ourselves, waiting for the adoption, to wit, the redemption of our body. And so the same way that Jesus was sighing, this inward groan is kind of what that word means. We groan now because we can see it. We don't understand it to the depths that Jesus did, but we can see it in our lives, in our world, in the lives of others, how sin breaks, how it destroys, how it tears down, how it manifests in wickedness and evil all around us, and everything that we see and everything that we do every day, and we just wait for the moment where we get to escape it all and go into a place of perfection where sin has not inhabited and it will never be there in any kind of way. We just get to be there and bask in the glory of God. We groan waiting for the redemption of our bodies because of the brokenness that has resulted due to sin. And then in his compassion, Jesus heals. He simply says, be opened, and it is done. Now, as was common in Jesus' miracles. And we've seen this throughout Mark. We'll continue to see it. There was no delay. There was no delay in the healing. Verse 35, and straightway his ears were open, and the string of his tongue was loosed, and he spake plain. There was no delay. It wasn't as if he had to go home and wait a few hours. It's not like taking a pill. It just happened immediately. The word straightway there, that is the Greek word eutheos. It is one of Mark's favorite words. In fact, he uses this word 40 times in his gospel. We talked about this, I don't know, it's been a while, but we talked about this in the introduction, how Mark is very action-oriented. Everywhere Jesus goes, he did this, and then immediately he goes there. He does this, and straightway, or immediately he goes over here. And so Mark uses this word a lot, but it is used well here, where immediately this man who had never been able to hear, who had never been able to speak properly, all of that is done away with. And so the man who couldn't hear, or the man who couldn't talk, he can now do both. Now, I don't want you to miss this at the end of verse 35. Don't miss this. This is kind of a miracle inside of a miracle. The man's ears were open, he can hear, and the man's tongue was loosed, and he spake plain. He just begins talking, and you wouldn't have known that there was anything different about this man's speech than anything about the people around him. Like I said, this is kind of a miracle inside of the miracle. This man has never heard a single word. He's been deaf. He doesn't know what language sounds like. He doesn't understand this. Again, this is why a lot of deaf people don't speak properly. And yet now he speaks as though he's done so his whole life. This was not just a miracle of the physical body. This was a miracle in the mind as well. As I said earlier, Jesus doesn't only give him the ability to speak, but he gives him the knowledge to speak. And so not only did he affect whatever it was that was keeping him from hearing properly, and he fixed that, but now he gives him the knowledge to speak as though he had done so his whole life. Again, if you pass by this man, there would be no learning curve. He just picked it up and he got it and he understood it, and he could speak plainly as everybody else. This was a physical healing. This was a mental healing. He fixed everything wrong about this particular man from that aspect. And then, I don't miss the irony here in verse 36. And he charged them that they should tell no man. I really think that's interesting. As soon as this man was given the ability to speak, he was commanded not to. Right? I mean, you got to think about it, how excited this guy would have been to not only just to hear. You can imagine how overwhelming this must have been to be able to hear all of these things coming in, and to be able to speak plainly and to hear and to communicate in a way that he'd never done. And as soon as he gets this ability, Jesus tells him, okay, now don't do it. Don't go tell anybody. I don't know if you've ever seen a video or been around of a child. They're incredible videos of whenever they get these, the cochlear implants, and a child who is deaf, and then they turn that thing on, and then suddenly they hear for the first time, and it's an amazing thing. And almost everyone that I've ever seen, they're just overcome with emotion. They don't know how to handle it. This is something that is so unique and something that they've never experienced before, and that's what I would only imagine this guy must have been experiencing. And then again, to add on top of that, the knowledge of how to speak and to do it properly. And then Jesus says, now don't. Now, this is not the first time that Jesus has done this. In fact, he's done it several times now. But this one is a little more curious, because just not too long ago, when he heals the demoniac, he commands him to go and to speak and to tell others about what he had done. And yet here he tells this man not to do it. And so we got to understand what's happening here. First of all, Jesus doesn't want the message to be that he is simply a miracle worker. I mean, he was. But we understand that he was far more. And so he doesn't want the message to be that he is simply a miracle worker. Furthermore, the former demoniac, the man who he commanded to go out and tell, was the first missionary to this area. He was telling people about something they had not yet heard about this Christ. Now, however, the people know. Again, he's not a stranger anymore. The people know who he is, and he's now in this Gentile area facing the same problems that he was back in Galilee with the crowds that have surrounded him. Now, remember back to last week, we talked about how this trip was likely an opportunity for him to get away and to spend some time with his disciples, to teach them, to disciple them. And so he's now run into the same problem. We understand that back in Galilee, there was times where he literally could not even walk into a home and sit down and eat, because the crowds were pressing him so much, even coming inside the homes. And so he's running into the same issue now. And we're going to see in chapter 8 that the crowd was genuinely large. And so he's run into the same problem. And so in other words, the message had spread, the word has gotten out, and there's no need to bring this crowd to an even higher fever pitch, right? We can understand, and we've talked about how these crowds will be pressing upon Jesus, and we've talked about how at times it must have been a little bit overwhelming, at least for the disciples' sake, because we understand when the people are heartbroken, are in need of something, and they know that Jesus is the answer. He can heal, He can fix, whatever the case they may be. How desperate they would have been to get to Him. Again, you have the woman crawling through the crowd to touch the hem of Jesus, and that kind of thing would have been going on. And so Jesus needs to have this time with His disciples, and the message is out there, and they're already throwing people at His feet to heal. And so again, there's no reason to, again, bump that up a level even higher than it already was. And so the point was getting the message out, and the message was out. However, as has been done, anytime that Jesus told a person, now He commanded the demons not to do it, and they listened. But anytime He commanded a person not to go out, we see that they didn't follow the command. In fact, not only did they not follow it, but they did not follow it to quite a degree here. Look at verse 36. But the more He charged them, so much the more, a great deal, they published it. Mark uses a lot of words here to say that Jesus tried to tell them, don't do it, don't go out there and speak, and it happened more than once. And it's the more He told them not to, it's like the more they began to shout it out, what Jesus had done. Now, they should have listened. They should have obeyed the words of Christ. But I think we can understand the impulse. I mean, if Jesus had done for us this physical miracle, what He did for this man, I too would want to go shout it to the rooftops to anybody who would listen. And so, again, I'm not excusing what the man had done by any means, but I think we can understand why the man did what he did. So not just because you want people to share in this amazing thing with you, but because you want to give praise to the one who did it. I mean, there'd be a worship aspect to this as well, but this is exactly what this man did, to the extent that the more Jesus asked him not to, the more he did it even more. And so we see why they were so unable to keep this event quiet there in verse 37. They were beyond measure astonished. They literally could not believe what had just happened. They weren't just astonished. They were beyond measure astonished. Listen, anytime you see adjectives stacked upon themselves like this in the Bible, they're not just throwing in words for the sake of it. They don't just like the way it sounds. They do this because it means something. They weren't just astonished. They were beyond measure astonished. God chooses these words on purpose. These words, the word for astonished here means literally to strike or to expel by a blow. That's what the word literally means. They were blown away by what Jesus had seen. That's what that's what Mark is saying here. They were so astonished that we read in Matthew's account that Matthew writes that they glorified the God of Israel, that they started praising and worshiping the one true God because of what they had seen. And that leads me here to the end of verse 37, and the way I want to close things down this morning. They were beyond measure astonished, saying, He hath done all things well. This phrase certainly rings true for everything that Jesus did. It rings true in the truth of creation. We understand back in Genesis chapter 1, it says after making all the things, in the last verse, God looks around and He proclaims it good. Everything that He had done, it was good. He had done all things well. But this is the simple truth. Jesus always makes all things well. He made the universe well. He made nature well. He made the first humans well before they rebelled and sinned against Him. The only reason why people are not well today, we understand it, is because of sin. When we see the brokenness around us, when we see a sickness, or in the case of this man, a disability, when we see deterioration, when we see anger, when we see hatred, when we see bitterness, when we see broken hearts, when we see confusion, when we see fear, when we see death, anything that is not in and of itself good, we know that it is a result of sin. And none of it has to do with what Jesus has made, because he made things well, and people came in and rebelled against that and brought sin into the world. What he made well, we contaminated. However, just as he has the creative power to make well what was not well in this man, again, whatever the particular issue was in his ear, Jesus fixed it. Whatever physical deformity was there, he made it well. He made it new. And just as he has the ability to do that, he has the saving power to take that which was dead and make it alive. Ephesians 2:1, it says, "And you hath he quickened who were dead in trespasses and sin." It says later in the chapter, Ephesians 2:5-7, it says, "Even when we were dead in sins, hath quickened us together with Christ." And again, that word quicken means made alive. And it says, "For by grace are you saved. And he hath raised us up together and made us sit together in heavenly places in Christ Jesus, that in the ages to come he might show the exceeding riches of his grace and his kindness toward us through Christ Jesus. And that which was dead is made new and well." 2 Corinthians 5:21, "For he hath made him to be sin for us, who knew no sin, that we might be made the righteousness of God in him." He didn't just take us from dead to alive. He took us from dead in our sins to the righteousness of God. He took us from unclean to clean, all because he hath done all things well. Let's pray this morning.